Alright, so there is this phenomenon on the right where they seem to want to make Joe Biden seem as cool as possible, okay, as absolutely based as possible. Now, obviously, I'm a socialist political commentator, many disagreements with Joe Biden, his administration, and everything that he stands for that I've elaborated on this channel previously, but it seems like the right is just insistent on making Joe Biden more appealing to somebody who is actually genuinely on the left, okay, basically through this method of trying to like conflate Joe Biden with like actual Marxists, right? Okay, so we have a perfect example of that here with Marjorie Taylor Greene, unfortunately the representative from my home state of Georgia, where she is basically, and when I first watched this, I swear to God, this was my first reaction, she's basically going to outline why people should vote for Joe Biden in 2024. Now, I'm not somebody who is, again, a Joe Biden supporter by any stretch of the imagination, but she's really pushing hard to make the case here, okay? So let's just go ahead and jump into this.
Lyndon B. Johnson is very similar to Joe Biden. How are they the same? They're both Democrat socialist. Lyndon B. Johnson.
Okay, so Lyndon B. Johnson was a Democratic socialist, right? Similar to Joe Biden, who apparently is also a Democratic socialist, right? The guy who ran his entire 2020 primary campaign against the actual Democratic socialist, Senator Bernard Sanders, right? And ran his entire campaign as being like, that guy, the Democratic socialist Bernie Sanders, is too extreme, and I am going to be the overtly pro-capitalist sort of like so-called centrist or moderate alternative to Bernie Sanders and his movement, okay? Now we're saying that Joe Biden is actually a Democratic socialist, Lyndon B. Johnson is actually a Democratic socialist, neither of them obviously are, but we are going to not only completely obfuscate on what the definition of Democratic socialism is, but we are going to attribute it now to two people who basically were in complete opposition to that actual fundamental ideology. Okay, so she continues here.
Johnson was the majority leader in the Senate. Does that sound familiar? He was vice president to Kennedy. Joe was vice president to Obama. He was appointed as the president after JFK was assassinated, then he was elected. His big socialist programs were the Great Society. The Great Society were big government programs to address education, medical care, urban problems, rural poverty, transportation, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and welfare, the Office of Economic Opportunity, and big labor and labor unions. Now, LBJ had the Great Society, but Joe Biden had Build Back Better.
Okay, so we're going to keep playing this. We're going to circle back around to Build Back Better, but I just want to lay out what she said so far, right? She said that Lyndon B. Johnson, similar to Joe Biden, who apparently is just the modern day Lyndon B. Johnson, was fighting for education, medical care, right, for especially impoverished communities through programs like Medicare, Medicaid, right? He was fighting for, civil rights, the voting rights legislation. Obviously, that was another big one in terms of his accomplishments, right? The expansion of programs like Social Security, right? Addressing actual problems that materially helped millions, tens of millions of people across the United States of America. And she's just basically like listing some of the most used and most popular social programs in the history of the United States of America, and just like sort of, I guess, assuming that the people who are listening to this are going to say, oh my God, yeah, those are big, scary socialist policies. Aren't they just so fucking terrible? And now listen, maybe a large, percent of the people who are listening to this speech right now in that crowd may agree with that sentiment, but the broad majority of the American people do not. They are opposed to cuts to things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, etc., right? Making investments in those things is actually widely popular, believe it or not. Materially uplifting the people on the bottom rung of the ladder in this country, believe it or not, is actually extremely popular. But this is, again, just one of these things that conservatives insist on doing, which is basically just listing off actual good politics and actual good policy as if it's a bad thing, and doing it in like a scary voice or like a silly voice and making fun of it and just assuming that people are going to track with them. But she continues here talking about Build Back Better, which, just as a reminder, didn't actually ever get passed. Okay, so let's see what she says about Build Back Better here.
And he still is working on it. The largest public investment in social infrastructure and environmental programs that is actually finishing what FDR started, that LBJ expanded on, and Joe Biden is attempting to complete.
Okay, So she's saying that there's a through line from FDR to Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, to Joseph Robinette Biden. Okay, and she is expecting, again, that people are going to, watch this clip and think, oh my God, he is going to be one of the worst presidents in American history. Okay, keep in mind, LBJ and FDR, while I have my different disagreements with them variously, as they governed, right, obviously, some of the most popular presidents in American history. FDR won election after election after election after election, okay? Probably the single most popular president in the history of the United States of America, and she's just saying Biden is the new FDR. He's finishing what FDR started, and that's somehow a bad thing, okay? I could not, in my wildest imagination, okay, if I was a Joe Biden staffer, if I was a Democratic establishment staffer or something like that, I could not come up with a better selling pitch, right? I wish that Joe Biden was the new FDR, maybe minus some of the racism, right? I wish that Joe Biden was the FDR 2.0 and that's how he was actually governing. Unfortunately, he was not, right? And especially, she references something like Build Back Better, right? The original $3.5 trillion Build Back Better program that was, being pushed by Bernie Sanders, for example, right? Joe Biden allowed two of the most corporate-backed candidates within his party, Kyrsten Sinema, who's now left the Democratic Party, and Joe Manchin, who is now threatening a third-party run, which I'm probably going to cover later today on this channel, right? Those two people alone, who are the most corrupt members within the Democratic Party, at least within the Senate, they eviscerated Build Back Better. Build Back Better was never passed. Some of the most popular social programs within that piece of legislation were completely torn apart. And again, somebody like Joe Manchin, and I covered this extensively at the time, but even if you want to make the argument, okay, Joe Manchin, he comes from a conservative state, right? West Virginia, right? If you actually look at the polling data, there was that one poll from Data for Progress within specifically the state of West Virginia that showed that West Virginia Democrats, Republicans, and even independents, right, supported Build Back Better in its entirety in the $3.5 trillion version of it by overwhelming margins, okay? So that's the policy that she's referring to, something that was supported in a state like West Virginia by a majority of Democrats, Republicans, and independents, okay? And she is referencing that as if it is like this terrifying phenomenon, right? Okay, so now, again, my first reaction when I saw this clip originally was I was like, oh my God, this is basically like a campaign ad for Joe Biden, which again isn't honest because that's not who Joe Biden is. He's not FDR 2.0, but I was like, damn, he could actually use this. And what did he do? He actually used it. So obviously this isn't Joe Biden himself personally, but whoever's on his staff who cut this ad together, props to you, because even though I disagree with Joe Biden on a multitude of different fronts, and I think he's a pathetic neoliberal through and through, this is a good advertisement and basically plays into what I think is going to be his selling pitch in the 2024 presidential election.
Joe Biden had the largest public investment in social infrastructure and environmental programs that is actually finishing what FDR started, that LBJ expanded on, and Joe Biden is attempting to complete. Programs to address education, medical care, urban problems, rural poverty, transportation, Medicare, Medicaid, labor unions. And he still is working on it.
Okay, so I mean, again, you got to give a little bit of props to the media team for the Biden administration. Obviously, again, I'm not a supporter of his 2024 run. I think he shouldn't even be running for re-election, right? I would much rather support somebody like Cornel West or Marianne Williamson and, actually get some new blood in there. I mean, Joe Biden's getting up there in age, but then on top of that, and even more importantly, he is not actually the representative of what that advertisement just put forward or what Marjorie Taylor Greene was alleging that he is a representative of, right? I mean, you want to talk about labor unions, for example, right? This is a guy who ran as sort of tacitly supporting the PRO Act, hasn't mentioned the PRO Act a single time since he got elected, right? Stopped the striking rail workers when they were trying to go on strike for basic improvements to their working conditions, wages, and benefits, etc., right? This is not a super pro-union president. I mean, maybe if you want to make comparisons to other recent presidents that we've had, like Donald Trump or Barack Obama or George W. Bush or Bill Clinton, sure, in the modern history of the United States, he has been relatively relatively more pro-labor in the sense of like his NLRB and who's he's appointed there and the leadership structure there. So I've given him credit on that, but he's certainly not like an aggressively like pro-labor president, right, through and through. And on top of that, I mean, medical care, for example, you know, this is a guy who ran on the public option as being the reasonable alternative to Bernie Sanders' radical Medicare for all plan that he said that he would veto if it passed Congress and ended up on his desk, right? I mean, this is not a guy who is actually a you know, leftist or a democratic socialist or a Marxist or whatever label that Marjorie Taylor Greene wants to use on any given day. He is nowhere even remotely close to those standards, but the rhetoric that she's using and the rhetoric that a lot of conservatives are using against Joe Biden is basically, in my opinion at least for somebody like me who is an actual leftist, would only increase the likelihood that especially young people are going to end up supporting his campaign. So she definitely flubbed there. Joe Biden doing a little bit of trolling, using her words against her. And yeah, I mean, I'll keep you guys updated as we get more information on the 2024 prospects. Again, not a Joe Biden supporter. I think that there is, you know, huge gaps in terms of what he needs to do between now and the 2024 election if he actually expects that he's not going to get wiped by Donald Trump running for election again. So we'll see how this plays out, but definitely entertaining to see conservatives continuing to follow through on this trend of basically just pointing to widely popular, you know, policies that materially improve the lives of millions and millions of people and just pretending as if they're bad things.
Everyone is saying GoodPoliticGuy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying